Alexis George, and I'm the Deputy CEO of ANZ.
Alexis, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Really glad to be here today.
Jumping right into the first question, as you think back on the early stages of your career, how did you know that you wanted to enter the financial services industry?
Well, that's a big question. You know, I came from a small country town, Bega, of about 4,000 people. And I always say my family was half the people in Bega, and if we weren't the family, we were married to the other half. So, right, really small country town, and my ambition was not very grand other than to leave Bega. So I don't know if many of you remember, but you had to go into the career counsellor and tell them what you wanted to do. And so I was sitting outside thinking, what do I want to do? I don't know what I want to do. Okay, I'm good at maths, I'm good at economics. I was flicking through the career book and I saw accountancy. So I thought, oh, that's what I'll do. So it's not a very structured plan about career. And so I did do that and ended up working for a chartered accounting firm for 2 years straight from school. Went part-time university and then full-time university. So I became a chartered accountant. And was very lucky with them to travel to London and Sydney and do a variety of things, as well as taking a few years off. And really when I arrived back in Australia, again, not very well planned, but I got my first role in financial services. And why? Because I needed a job and I needed some money, and that was who was employing. And so I started my career in financial services with BT, that's now at Westpac, and have not for one day regretted that or thought that was a bad decision, because it's allowed me to get to where I am today.
Looking back at your career, what were some of your key learnings or achievements?
I think my key learnings, and I've changed them over the years, but they always stay the same. The first one is work hard and do the best you can in the job you're in today. A lot of people are always thinking about what's next, but you've got to be good at what you're doing today. So that's really important. Just do the best you can every single day. I think the other thing is to be curious. We're in a world today where things are changing rapidly. The last 12 months of COVID, they've changed exponentially. And so you do have to be curious about AI or machine learning or, you know, the advancements in the use of data. Because as an executive or a leader, how can you run a business if you're not aware of the opportunities to improve those customer experiences? So I think being curious, always learning for the reasons I just said. It doesn't have to be reading, it doesn't have to be courses, but talking to people, etc. For me, it's be a bit of a risk taker as well. You know, I worked in places like the Czech Republic, and people always look at me and say, why? But as an individual, professionally and personally, they'll probably be years where I grew most. So I think you're taking those risks. And for me, the last one is just making sure you're always authentic. You know, in different circumstances, you have to adjust your behaviour, right? Or you have to adjust certain aspects of the way you might interact. But I think it's always important to be authentic, because people can see if you're not, and they won't follow or question or do what you need them to do. And that's something I really try hard to maintain.
Alternatively, what were some of the biggest hurdles that you've encountered? How did you overcome them? And did any of them relate to being a woman in business?
You know, I often get asked that question about a woman, but in terms of hurdles, I mean, you're always confronted with hurdles, right? I mean, you can't be in any of these jobs without hurdles. So, you know, I won't give specific examples, but for me, when there's ever something that looks insurpassable, always take a deep breath. Remember, I don't have to be an expert in anything. I've got a massive team around me whose skills and experience I can embrace, and really just be calm about the situation. It doesn't help if I'm squawking around like a headless chook, right? Because we're all confronted with things we just haven't seen before. You know, at ANZ, I've led our response to COVID over the last 12 months. And I remember on 16th of March last year, I mean, everyone wanted to go home, and we have 45,000 people across 33 countries all wanting to leave the office in one day. And we couldn't. We weren't ready for that. And so, you know, having to deal with that, work with IT, how can we do this? Who are we going to prioritise? Because we have to keep people's well-being in mind. That was something I've never encountered in my life, but just being calm, methodically working through what are we trying to achieve here, who do I need to help me, and get them all in the pen. So that's the way I approach any hurdle in life, and you don't have to be an expert in anything. You can ask questions and really bring people's skills. In terms of being a woman, I'm a pretty resilient kind of person, so I think sometimes I didn't notice it. But I like to think back to the experience when I probably first became a senior executive, and I was in the executive room, and I'd become a bit comfortable. You know, the first time in those rooms, everyone's uncomfortable. Doesn't matter what their face says, the first times everyone has imposter syndrome. And we were in the exec room, I was the only woman, and that was the case in many situations in my earlier career. And I used to sit there, and the men would often go off to the bathroom or something and come back, and it was like a decision had been made. I'm like, what happens in that bathroom, right? Does all the decisions get made in there? And I don't know if it was about the bathroom, but I think it wasn't a deliberate exclusion, but I definitely felt like I'd been excluded from some of the decisions. And having been brave enough to call that out, and to make sure as other women came into the executive that they didn't feel the same way. So yeah, I've had experiences like that in my career. I often get asked for the worst war story, and I would never tell it, because I don't actually think that helps in women achieving what I think we can achieve moving forward. And I'd rather focus on where we are now and how do we get to full equality, rather than telling war stories, which I don't think helps in our cause. But as a woman, I tell you, I'm 100% committed to making sure my management team is always 50% female to male, and that I help people come through the ranks as much as possible and give as much time as I can to help them develop.
You said before that you believe engaged teams and workplace collaboration are business imperatives. Can you point to any key initiatives that yourself as a leader or ANZ Bank have implemented in order to support workers, especially women?
Oh look, there's so many things, and maybe I'll talk specifically about the work thing and then more about engagement and collaboration. You know, I think I'm lucky enough to work with a CEO who truly believes in diversity and inclusion in all its forms, and that's just not about female, male, but it's about people with disabilities and, of course, different sectors of the community. So that is really important to me. It's all well and good to say that though, and it's all well and good to even have targets, and we have both those things. We have targets and we have a real commitment, but it's putting in place the processes to make sure that there isn't this inequality bubbling around in an organisation of 45,000 people. So here, for instance, we make sure that there has to be a female included in the final 3 or 4 of any position, especially leadership positions. We make sure that the interview panel is diverse. It always has to include a woman on the interview panel, so it cannot be all male or all female, alternatively as well. And we actually monitor by team what the targets actually are, and are they or aren't they being achieved. And people are asked to explain those things if they're not meeting those particular targets. The other thing we do, which is a bit controversial, is because women, typically because they have the children, had less superannuation balances. So every woman in ANZ also gets an additional $500 superannuation a year, so to try and contribute to that inequality in terms of retirement. So I think all of those processes are in place, including flexibility policies for both women and men, and I think that's really important, women and men, and of course the parental policies are also for both women and men in our organisation. So I think we've done a lot. There's also many organic groups that have grown up about helping women together and mentoring, but they're important systems and processes that have been put in place. Now, if we talk about collaboration and engagement, there's a lot of that, right? And we have monthly pulse checks to see how people are feeling and what they feel that we're not doing. I think in the last 12 months that has escalated enormously, right? Because communication has been important because we're all living in a virtual world. So weekly, our CEO and myself would do all staff calls. I'd probably do 5 big calls a week. So some with our offshore centres, specific staff in Australia, just to communicate, allow people to ask questions anonymously or named so we know what they're really wanting to hear and be involved in. We run virtual coffee shops now, which I've just done one this morning with randomly selected 10 people again, so you can find out what's really going on in the organisations. And we have a number of social tools internally where staff can get engaged. So, it is really, especially in a world where a lot of us are still living virtually, I think that communication is incredibly important, having the support mechanisms important, but making sure those informal communications also exist.
Now, as Deputy CEO and Group Executive of ANZ Wealth, what does your role entail and what does your day-to-day look like?
I get asked a lot of times, what does being the Deputy CEO entail? And, when I was asked to take on the role, I'm not sure we ever actually drafted a job description. So it's very different roles that I play, and it's changed a lot. Firstly, I do anything that a CEO doesn't want to do or doesn't like to do, so that's a lot of it. But in all seriousness, I do run a couple of businesses. So yes, I run our wealth business, which I've done so for many years. I also run our entire payments businesses, which is all of the transactions. I run our offshore centres as well, and we have 3 of those in India, in the Philippines and in China. So they're my primary responsibilities. Obviously, as a Deputy CEO, though, I have other responsibilities. So I've been responsible for our COVID response for the last 12 months. It's making sure coordinating the entire bank so we can deliver to customers, making sure we look after our employees during this time in terms of, and even things like developing a Healthy Me app so we support them, making sure we're involved in communications. I do a lot of the government and regulatory interactions. So before the last 12 months, spent quite a bit of time in Canberra talking to the politicians and Treasury down there. And I do quite a bit of the communications both internally and externally. So, if I look at my day today, which is probably not an atypical day, I spent some time this morning with a customer for half an hour just talking to them about how we'd supported them and what they needed going forward. I just had a virtual coffee with 10 people this morning of our staff to understand what's happening.
As a previous leader in the Asia Pacific and Europe regions, how did you tailor your leadership styles to adapt to these cultures?
Look, I have been so lucky to work in London, to work in Prague and to work in Hong Kong and of course Sydney. Oh, I've worked in Adelaide as well. No, but when I first went offshore as a leader to Prague and I was CEO across Czech Republic and Slovakia, I thought, I'll just carry on the way I have been in Australia. And that was all well and good. I thought life would be wonderful. When I first arrived in Prague, firstly, not everyone speaks English. There lies the first problem, because I think I'm reasonably good with connecting with staff. Secondly, all they had ever had in the history of the businesses, now remember they were communist up to 1990, were Dutch CEOs. Now, if you know anything about the Dutch people, they're all really tall, and they were all men, so they're all 6'6". And suddenly a 5'4" 5'4", okay, a bit ambitious, but 5'4" Australian woman arrives to be their CEO. I think they thought a Martian had arrived. And I mention that because I did have to alter my leadership style. And a great learning for me was I walked into the first executive room, and we had a session. I explained to them what they should expect of me as a leader and what I expected of them as a team. And I walked out, I thought, oof, did a pretty good job of that. I was sitting in my office, which was monstrous because that's what was expected there. And the head of HR, who I'll be eternally grateful to, came to me and said, Alexis, they think you're a weak leader. And I said, how could they possibly form that opinion? They don't know me at all, yet they formed the opinion I'm a weak leader. And she said, because you didn't sit at the head of the table, you just plonked yourself down wherever, that was the immediate interpretation that you're a weak leader. Now that sounds so minor, right? But it really taught me I had to adjust, and I never sat anywhere but the head of the table from then on in, right? I really did have to adjust my style. And some things were important to the people there that were completely irrelevant to me. Like the size of my office. Did I care? Not one iota. But for them, it was a real sign of importance and seniority. So I learned a lot from that experience. I also learned you do have to adapt. I had to be a bit more directive than would be natural for me in an Australian context. But you have to have a line where you're not prepared to go, know where that line is, and just adapt. So I think, look, that was much bigger experience than learning moving to Hong Kong. But, you know, the differences in Hong Kong, I was dealing with the entire Asia because I was in an Asian role. And you realise very quickly that people from India are not the same as people from China. And, you know, there's different respects for seniority. So in India, just because they say yes, that doesn't mean yes, that means I heard you, right? And so you have to learn different things like that and really adapt to those cultures. And I think that's stood me in good stead coming back to this role.
As a final round-out question, and as a woman in leadership, what do you think future cohorts of graduates can learn about challenging perceptions and pushing boundaries, especially about their own limitations? And do you have any general advice for those graduating during a global pandemic?
Oh, look, I hope we never have to answer that question again. I would just love to live where it was based success was based on your capabilities and your attitudes, right? I really, really would love that kind of world. I suppose the thing I always come back to, because there are biases, is remember it's their problem, not my problem. And, you know, I think I'm not doing a bad job and I'm going to keep on doing it despite what's going on around me. It's really easy to say, right? I'm a bit older than most of the people that you're talking to or that are listening to this, but I think it's really important to have some self-confidence. And you know, the other really important thing to do is we're not all prepared to take risks. It's hard sometimes to step forward. And even today, I watch our female graduates or our female staff always wanting to tick every capability box on a job description before stepping forward. I can assure you some of our male counterparts do not do that. If they've got 40%, that's enough. I'll have a go and step forward, right? So you need to find that person who, when you don't step forward, will put their foot in your back and push you forward to go for that role. Because what's the worst thing that can happen? Someone says no. Whoop-de-doo, right? You move on to the next day. So I think really, just being a bit braver, taking that step forward, it's always stood me in good stead. Sometimes I didn't take the step forward, everyone else went backwards, but, I think it's really important to have that self-confidence, to really realise if no's the worst thing that can happen, it's not that bad. You learn from it and you move on.
Well, thank you, Alexis, for joining us today and giving up some of your time to come speak to us. You've definitely given myself and our audience some resonating thoughts and perspectives that we can all implement in our journey to forging passionate career paths.
My pleasure, Anna.